scripture comes from the chapter Mark chapter 4, verses 39 and 40. Mark chapter 4, verses 39 and 40. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?"
I'm going to try something a little bit different. Can I stand in front of this mic right here with this mic on? Cool, okay. Just didn't want to blow anybody's eardrums out. One time I got up here and it did this like loud pop or explosion or something like that. Woke me up, my heart was beating fast, my knees were knocking a little bit harder, and I could tell everyone was just like wide-eyed and awake. It worked, everyone was awake, but it's not a great way to start off every lesson, just every once in a while. So I went to a cemetery this past week at night, later at night. And before you think that I just go and sit in cemeteries at night, I'll explain to you a little bit why I was there. I was looking for a certain tombstone that belonged to a guy named Ernest T. Gyers, and it's from the 1800s, late 1800s. And I was looking all over for this tombstone, and it's the Valamosa Springs Cemetery. I don't know if you know where that is, if you've driven past it before. It's a little creepy at night, and it's tucked away kind of in this little back road area. And so I pulled in the car, and there's this dirt road that loops around the entire cemetery. And so I start driving around, not thinking about the creepiness of the area, just looking for this headstone. And I'm looking out the window, and I'm driving around the whole thing. I didn't find it. But on my second time around, I saw this smaller dirt road that kind of cut through the middle of all of them. And so I decided to turn down that road and see if I could find this headstone. And so I drove down about halfway, and I thought, I should just Google where this headstone is, and I could find it so much faster. So I put the car in park, I pulled my phone out, and I started to type it in, and then I looked up, and my headlights were shining on all of these tombstones and casting all these creepy shadows. And like any normal person would do, I very respectfully but quickly got out of the cemetery. And I guess I was in a panic or something, or just wasn't thinking. I turned and went down the wrong road, and my wife just happened to be watching me on this GPS tracking app called Life 360, and she sent me a text that said, "You're driving down a dead-end road." And my heart started beating really fast, and I was like, I got to turn around. I got to get out of here. And so I whipped around, and I sped a little bit faster, and I got onto the main highway and started racing back home. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in ghosts. But there's something about a cemetery that's a little bit spooky at night. And I think that's normal. I think everyone agrees that. I think I just had it in my brain that I finally found out where this guy was buried at, and I'm doing research for a project that has nothing to do with this story. But I finally found where it was, so I wasn't thinking about the hour or the location or anything like that. We're going to talk about a similar experience, not really, but it has to do with a tomb in Mark chapter 5. And I think this is an account that probably most of us here are familiar with, but there's a very eerie setting here. Mark chapter 5, if you have your Bibles, just go ahead and open up to this. We're going to spend all of our time this morning looking at this account. And even though it might be familiar, I think we're going to look at it in a different light and look at it from a different angle, kind of read between the lines a little bit here. And find out some things about this passage that maybe you haven't considered before. In Mark chapter 5, we see that there are three worlds that collide together. You have the underworld with the demons, and you have the world of the human experience, and then you have the upper world where Christ is, where God is, the God the Father, and they all merge together in this one chapter, and it's pretty incredible. The account is one that we're familiar with, and it's an eerie setting. It's late in the evening. We know that from chapter 4, which we had read for us here. Starting in verse 35, it says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them," that is Jesus to his disciples, "Let's go across to the other side of Galilee." It was evening. And this storm breaks out as they are on the Sea of Galilee, and it's a violent storm, violent enough that these men that are familiar with the water, they're fishermen, they're familiar with the Sea of Galilee, they've probably been through some storms before. It's so bad that they wake up Jesus, who is sleeping at the stern on a cushion, and they wake him up and said, "Master, do you not care that we're perishing, that we're dying out here?" And Jesus says those famous words, "Peace be still," and the storm is calm. Galilee is only about 8 miles across, so by the time they get to the other side of Galilee, it's still dark. And the whole setting, as you begin to read through it, is just spooky. The disciples arrive on the other side of the shore with Jesus, and they're already shaken from the storm. At the end of chapter 4, we see that they are fearful of the power of Jesus. And I don't know when it was that they realized this. Perhaps they had to just peer through the darkness to see that cliff face that's on up past the beach. And they realized we are in a forbidden place. If you look in Leviticus chapter 21 and verse 11, it talks about how the places of the dead are unclean and were forbidden to go. And you would become unclean if you were around the dead. And so they pull up on this beach, and the water is now calm as glass, but it's still dark out. And they realize there are tombs right in front of them. And then Mark uses a word that he uses several times throughout his book, and that's the word immediately. He likes the word immediately. Usually he uses this word just to prove how powerful Jesus is. After he heals the paralytic, after he heals a leper, he uses this term, immediately they were healed. Immediately they were made well, to show how powerful Jesus is. It wasn't this long, drawn-out ceremony where the person just slowly rises to his feet. When Jesus healed someone, it happened immediately to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. But he uses the word here differently. He says, immediately, that is, without warning, suddenly, a demon-possessed man emerges from these tombs. The tombs are located, they're usually located away from cities, away from any towns, and they're carved into limestone, or they use the natural caves in the limestone, and they would use them as places to bury their dead or to cover their dead, and they would place them in wooden sarcophagus, and they would carry them and place them inside these caves. And sometimes they would seal them off, but there's a back entrance where they could place more family members or more people inside of these tombs. And it's here in these tombs that this man lived. It wasn't his choice. The demons inside of him forced him to live as an outcast, alone, isolated in these tombs, among the sarcophagus inside these tombs. And the text doesn't tell us why that the demon chose to have this man live in this area, but it could have been some kind of psychological torture. I get it. Tombs and cemeteries are very scary places to be. What could be more frightening than this scenario right here? Mark chapter 5 mentions only one demon-possessed man, but if you look, it's mentioned in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Matthew, in Matthew chapter 8, mentions two demon-possessed men. Some people will look at this and they'll say, well, Matthew chapter 8 says that there are two demon-possessed men. Mark chapter 5 says that there's only one demon-possessed man. Well, there you go. There's a contradiction in the Bible. But when you look at the context, the purpose of Mark, the purpose of Matthew, the purpose of Luke, all of which those accounts are recorded there, there's different purposes behind them. Matthew mentions two, Mark mentions one, probably because the one that came and spoke to Jesus and had this conversation with Jesus was more prominent, or the things that he had to say and the things that Jesus had to say to this man had some kind of spiritual bearing on the audience that Mark is talking to here. Or it could just be that Matthew is adding another detail or all the above. It's like if you had two apples and you placed them on the table and you said, there's an apple on the table. You're not wrong. There could be two there. They don't contradict each other at all. So there's two. And they're running. If you read through this account, it says that it emerged immediately. There met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He's double unclean. He's unclean because he was around the dead, and he's unclean, the word there meaning filthy, because he's filled with a bunch of demons. And he is running at Jesus and the disciples. What would you do? Because as you read more about this man, his life, where he is, and the reputation that he has in that town, it just gets even scarier. In verses 3 and 4, we see something very interesting, and that's he was growing in strength. He was growing in strength throughout time. And we see in verse 3, it says, he lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him, notice the word, anymore. Anymore. At some point, they were able to control him maybe a little bit, but then he goes on to say that he had often been shackled. Those shackles had worked at some point, but again, Scripture doesn't reveal to us how he was growing. Was it that there were more demons coming inside of him? We know he had a lot of them. Or were they just taking more a hold of his mind? Or we don't really know. But we do know that he was growing in strength. And then in verse 5 it says, day and night he cried out. I don't know what you imagine when you read through this or how good your imagination is, but mine runs away with me a little bit sometimes, and that just seems absolutely terrifying. Day and night, crying out. He is in absolute misery. And when you combine that with the echoing and amplified of that noise through the tombs and the cliffs and the acoustics around that area, it could have been heard for quite a distance. We also see that he was cutting himself, mutilating himself. He was not living a very good life at all, to say the least. Verse 6, it says, when he saw Jesus from afar. He was watching Jesus. Is that not creepy? The fact that he had seen Jesus from afar, and when you think about, if chapter 5 comes right after chapter 4, which I believe, it's dark, this man that's possessed with a demon is watching this storm on the Sea of Galilee from his location there in the tomb, and he is seeing all the rain and hearing all the wind and seeing those waves, and it's this violent, violent storm, and then all of a sudden the sea is calm. And then there's a boat coming to shore. He'd probably watched many boats come to that shore. But the boat coming from the storm that just went away, that probably got his attention. He sees Jesus from afar. And I believe that he noticed power. When he saw this violent storm and then it's instantly calm, I believe he goes, that's power and I need power. He needed Jesus. He was filled with all of these demons. His life was absolute misery. He wanted to jump on this opportunity, so he runs towards Jesus. Regardless of the purpose, though, I believe that probably all of the disciples were beginning to inch their way back to the boat. Maybe some of them ran back to the boat. I can see Peter doing that. But I want to read verses 7 through 11 here. It says, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. So he addresses Jesus as Son of the Most High God. And when you look at it, maybe it seems like he is humiliating him or humbling himself before Jesus and addressing him in this reverent way almost. But when you look into the Jewish culture at the time, they were very superstitious, and they believed that if you could identify the spirit that was inside of a man, if you could call it by name, then you could somehow gain control of that spirit. And so I believe that maybe this man with the possessed demons, or who was possessed, I believe he was trying to gain control of Jesus maybe in some way. And so Jesus asks the demon, what is your name? And the response is, we are legion, for we are many, in an attempt to maybe intimidate Jesus. We're many. And when we notice as we read through this account that there are people that are on the beach along with the disciples that are witnessing all of this. So it must have been some scene. If it is late at night, if they were asleep, they must have woken up, come down to the beach to see what was going on. And this whole scene unfolds right before them. The demon asks some very strange questions of Jesus. First, we see that they loved that country. We see, as it goes on in the account here, starting in verse 9, it says, and Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. Legion referring to a Roman group of soldiers, usually numbering around 6,000. Now, that doesn't mean there were 6,000 demons inside him, but the idea is that there were a lot of them inside of him. Verse 10, and he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. That's interesting to me. Why would the demons ask Jesus not to send them out of the country? That area at the time was very pagan. They were influenced by the Greeks, by the Herodians, and so they really didn't worship the God of heaven for the most part. We do know that there were some Jews in the area, but I think because there was so much pagan influence in that area, them getting exorcised the chances of them getting exorcised was a little bit lower. But they loved that country. It was pagan. The Decapolis was there, largely influenced by all of these other nations and all of these other gods. But I want you to notice that these demons begged Jesus 3 different times, in verse 7, in verse 10, and verse 12. And all of their requests are strange. Don't throw us out of this country. And then he says, don't torture me before the time. And then he begs them to send him into pigs. The pigs. That's a little bit random. But we know that the Jews were not allowed to eat them, but we don't know for certain if they weren't allowed to farm them. The Romans could eat them, so maybe they were Jewish farmers there, and they were trying to raise these pigs to give to the Romans. And the thought of soldiers in a Roman legion eating those pigs is a little bit ironic, especially in this account here. But the herdsman could have been Gentile as well. When I'll start reading in verse 14, and we'll stop in 20. Verse 14 says, the herdsman fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, and he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. When the herdsmen arrived to the scene, there is a sea full of pig carcasses that had jumped off of this cliff. And I was looking at some photographs of the area here, and there's this large slope that kind of funnels its way into the Sea of Galilee. So this is a dramatic scene. All of these demons inside this herd of swine, they all rush down the hill and jump into the sea. What's going on? If you're someone who's just on the beach watching all of this happen, your world is now rocked. Especially if you were someone who was on that beach and saw the storm and saw that storm be calmed and then all of this take place. Who's Jesus? That's the question that Mark is trying to answer in his book by proving that Jesus is the Son of God through all of the miracles that he records here. But what is the application for us? What's the application for us in a story about demons and tombs and pigs? It's relevant. That's one of the things I love about the Bible, is there are accounts and there are stories that they take a little bit of digging to find out, why did God think that this should go in the only book that he ever wrote? Why is this account in here? And then doing that digging and finding out, oh, that's why. It's very powerful. They're afraid. They're afraid of Jesus. And that's, to me, everything that's going on here. You have the tombs, you have these demons, and their reaction to Jesus after he casts the demons out and into the pigs and heals this man. They're afraid of Jesus. They had become comfortable with the lives that they were living. That included the life that they were living with a demon-possessed man who was yelling day and night in the tombs. They had become comfortable there. That was their life. They were used to that. But they weren't willing to accept Jesus. So they beg him to leave. They beg him to leave because they knew the power of Jesus. They knew he was powerful, but they didn't care to know his love or to seek out his love. If they had sought to know that love, then that love would have cast out the fear that they had. And really, that's the entire thing, that Jesus is trying to bring his disciples to that point. Because even after he calms the storm, we see that they're afraid of Jesus. But Jesus is trying to bring them into maturity. That's how it happens in the Christian walk today, not in the same instance as that, but when we are new Christians or when we are coming to a knowledge of God, we are fearful of the power of God. After all, God is in control of my eternal destiny. God has my soul in his hands. That God could punish me for eternity. That God is powerful. He made the world. He can do anything. He holds my breath in his hand. He breathed it into me in the first place. There's fear involved, but as you mature in your Christian walk, you see the love of Jesus. And you see exactly how much he loves us, and we begin to mature. So that healed man longed to be with Jesus, and I would too. If I had lived my life that long and in that way, if my Savior came and healed me, I would want to get in that boat with Jesus too. But Jesus looked at this man and saw that he was the perfect missionary. In fact, he had been transformed into this living, breathing, walking sermon. Everybody knew who that guy was in that area, and more people were about to know who he was. What a powerful sermon he had. Verse 20 is my favorite verse in this entire section. It says, he began to proclaim how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. What has Jesus done for us? What has Jesus done for you? And the second question we have to ask ourselves in reading through this account is, do people know it? When you look at this, when you look at Mark, this chapter and the rest of chapter 4 and the rest of chapter 5 here, we see that Jesus is powerful. I mean, that is a big message that Mark is trying to deliver. He's the master of the deep. We see he's the master over demons. He's the master over disease. He's the master over death. Yes, he's powerful. But Jesus went through a storm for you, just like he went through a storm for the demon-possessed man. When Jesus came to this earth, when he lived his life, and when he left heaven in all of its glory, when he came down and when he was rejected, despised by men, when he was put through all of that agony and torture and put up on the cross, he went through a storm for us. Jesus washed away the legion of sins that condemned us to a life among the spiritually dead. Yes, he's powerful, but to know his love should make you fall in love with him. Mark is a very powerful book. It's a book that will keep your attention, and it's a book that will help you grow. And I hope this account has proven that to you today, and I hope that you go back and look through this. There is so much more to be pulled out of this passage than I have time for today. But I also want to take this moment to offer an invitation. The invitation is offered every Sunday, but the invitation of Christ is always open as long as time is still allowed to go on. If you don't have Jesus, then you are in a similar spiritual state as the man who was living in the tomb, separated from Jesus, living among the dead. You need Jesus whether you recognize that or not. And I hope this morning that if you fear God as a powerful God or see him as this powerful judge and that's it, I hope that this has somehow helped you fall more in love with Jesus than you were yesterday or even this morning. But if you have not put on Christ in baptism, then that is what you need to change in your life today. This opportunity right now. Without Jesus, you are in a world of hurt just like this man was here. It's that dramatic, just in a different way. I hope if this is something you've been thinking about, that today will be the day where you change that and where you put on Christ in baptism. Or maybe you are separated from Christ because you've fallen into some sin problem, or maybe you've just not been where you need to be spiritually and you need help and you need the prayers of this congregation. That's what we're here for, and that's what this time for is right now, if you need to make that a public response. If we can do anything for you, then why not come right now as we stand and as we sing.
Would you be